Welcome to the fourth season of the lecture series of the Network for Ocean World. This fourth season is about making measurements on ocean worlds, with the first episode giving an overview of upcoming missions. For this episode, we welcome two program scientists at NASA. First, Kelsey Bisson, working on ocean biology and biogeochemistry, and then Curt Niebur for outer planets and ocean worlds.
Kelsey Bisson is a program scientist for NASA's Ocean Biology and Biogeochemistry program and maintains an appointment at Oregon State University as an associate professor. This talk's going to provide an overview of the upcoming NASA missions monitoring Earth's biology, including PACE GLIMR and SBG, and it will identify synergistic research across Earth and planetary science. So with all ado, Kelsey.
Yeah, great, thank you. Let's see if this can work from here. Okay, can you see the slide as like one full slide, or is it still in the?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I'm Kelsey, and I'm new to the program science side of ocean biology and biochem, but I feel like I really grew up in the program academically from my PhD, postdoc, and everything until now. And I work on both ice systems from ICET2, which you may know about, as well as global ocean ecosystem work. And I wanted to talk today about some ideas that our program has supported in the past at the NOW interface, as well as some takeaways from the workshop in Catalina that I was very lucky to attend, and was my first time interacting really with planetary scientists thinking about the ocean and other places. So if you're unfamiliar, our program is really looking at describing through observations, understanding, and building a predictive understanding of the biological and ecosystem of our global ocean. And we use a lot of remote sensing. It's not just satellite work, but suborbital campaigns and aircraft, and also fund to host a field efforts to validate these things. And modeling as well is a really big component of the program. We're really excited to be launching PACE, the Plankton, Aerosols, Clouds, and Ecosystems mission, January 30th, which has been 23 years in the making, I'm told. This satellite will have hyperspectral capabilities and beautiful revisit times of roughly 2 days, 1 to 2 days in different regions, and 1 kilometer pixel size. And really the goal of PACE is to move beyond chlorophyll or single phytoplankton stock assessments and into an assessment of phytoplankton community. So the idea is that the hyperspectral remote sensing observations will enable, through added information content, a wide variety of the different phytoplankton or other material types in the ocean and the water column. I'm aware that that's not yet available to use in other ocean worlds because ice is obviously a big barrier. But we're thinking a lot about incorporating PACE with other satellite technologies, including ICET2, and modeling to think about how those can be used together. And that's a space I think that can be very relevant for other ocean worlds. So this is from our decadal, not the decadal capital D, but our own OBB vision for the next 10 years. And as you can see in the top panel over our immediate near term and long term, some of them are goals, of course. Some of them are very much happening. I just mentioned PACE. We're also very excited about GLIMR, which will be a geostationary satellite in the Gulf of Mexico region, providing hourly observations during sunlight hours, and thinking and conceiving of some follow-on studies with those as well. And you may have heard of the SBG mission or the Surface Biology and Geology mission as well. So all that said, we're really thinking and excited about these different assets that are primarily passive radiometers, requiring sunlight to illuminate the ocean, and then we're really observing that signal that's emanating, the water-leaving radiance. But also you can see in that panel, we're also excited about the capabilities of LiDAR and envisioning in the near future having active remote sensing that is ocean optimized be a part of our portfolio. And already you might be aware of Calypso and ICET2. Those are 2 LiDAR satellites that were intended for other non-ocean uses, but we've really benefited quite a bit from taking those data observations and understanding the ocean through those. So there's some I mean, I won't go into all of this, but just to give you a taste of kind of what our mission, or what our program is supporting. there's, I think, quite a bit of potential at the ocean interface and with now. And I fully trained earth scientist, and I hadn't really interacted much with planetary scientists until I had been to the workshop on Kelly Island. It was really phenomenal to talk with others and think about how people are doing complementary analyses and just dealing with a host of different challenges in a way that I'm really happy to hear more about what this group is working on and getting, ideas from that there. I think at Earth, places that are obvious analogs are the sea ice formation and really interface type studies dealing with the structure and impact on algal life. And despite a number of autonomous assets and satellite assets that we've invested in as a community, there are still a lot of foundational questions at that interface. Strictly speaking, how does ice influence ocean life and phytoplankton? Depending on different studies, there's a lot more questions to be asked and answered that have yet been answered. And that's a really exciting area that, obviously has a lot of potential and relevance for ocean worlds covered in ice. There's some ideas that we're taking from the meeting in the sense that there's new technology clearly that would need to be invented and implemented in order to really observe in situ these ocean worlds. And I admit that some of my colleagues and I at this past workshop, who again, very naive and hadn't really been in the space much, weren't clear on where the capabilities were and where the research is going. And we were assuming like maybe it's already possible to drill into Enceladus or something, for example, and then have autonomous floats. And clearly we're not there yet. But the point is we obviously hopefully would want to be there in the future. And so thinking about technology and test driving it on Earth and even remote technology, of course, there's a big need for understanding what the satellites will see, like Clipper, for example, and on what they see on Earth and how we can relate that and ingest that within models to get better understanding. I think that a primary way, because we know Earth is very different than these other ocean worlds and not a perfect analog to bridge these issues, is a lot of modeling work, including sensitivity tests. And we talked a bit about Bayesian analyses. And what's interesting to me and kind of exciting is that there's such a wide parameter phase space in these other ocean worlds, and really constraining that seems right now it's an unconstrained problem. And there are a lot of ways that in ocean biology on Earth we've been dealing with these better constrained, I would say, because we certainly have a lot of ideas of even the salinity, et cetera, but still there are a lot of areas that are unconstrained in thinking about the modeling that's needed to accomplish that. One thing that we've been struggling with our Earth satellites that I would like to talk to the participants more about here for their ideas we're thinking about more is the influence or importance of atmospheric correction, or is it relevant for some of the studies that are involved? We know on Earth with our ocean studies, how atmospheric correction is performed has dramatic differences on not only the data quality, but then of course the interpretation of Earth observation data. And we've had a host of studies come out even recently showing that some of the current atmospheric correction schemes may not be finely tuned as we thought they were, and they have led to interpretations that might be slightly different. And so thinking about, observing ocean life or even just ocean ecosystems beneath ice surfaces, I'm curious to hear about the role or suspected role of the atmospheric component. As a program, we've funded some efforts with ocean worlds, not as a primary piece of the program, but as interdisciplinary pieces. And so you might not be familiar with our interdisciplinary science call through ROSES. On the last call, there was a sub-element for ocean worlds. This was solicited earlier this year, and we selected 3 proposals from that call. And I would say that there could be a lot of opportunities for more growth and more participation in that call, as there I don't know how many proposals we're expecting to see, but there could definitely be more in this space. So some examples are what's below. ISAT-2, and someone stopped me, but I'm not familiar with this group and how much they know about some of these satellites, but I can explain ISAT-2 briefly if that would be useful. Yes,
I think a brief overview would be good. We have a broad set of disciplines here. Thanks.
Okay, super. Thank you, Erin. Yeah, sorry, the way that my screen is sharing, I can't see any faces, and I don't want to just ramble about it if it's not of interest. ISAT-2 was launched in 2018, and it's a photon altimeter. it has incredibly high resolution. And so the way it operates like a LiDAR is that it sends out laser signal at 532 nanometers. This signal, based on the speed of light and the time of return after the photons are emitted, you can calculate the distance between the satellite and Earth. And that's used to detect sea ice freeboard or sea ice height above sea level, as well as some very unknown, or like, how do I say this? Discoveries from that satellite that were unintended, but really, really cool. And so because the satellite, though this LiDAR is so powerful, it can actually resolve vertical structure in the ocean water column down to 15 meters, and possibly it could go down further if it had been ocean optimized. So that's really exciting because it's the only satellite we have in space that enables vertical resolution of the ocean. And that's really important, of course, for understanding, you know, stratification dynamics. Understanding even where particles are in the upper water column is really important for us. And that satellite is like special in a sense that it's so powerful. There's another LiDAR satellite that I mentioned a few slides ago, Calypso, which is being decommissioned, and it also has enabled some really cool studies. LiDAR in the ocean is, in my opinion, underused, but one thing that's really special about it is that unlike passive ocean color sensors, which rely on sun, you know, to illuminate the water so you can see the signal, the active sensors don't, so they can operate during night. And in the ocean during night, there are these mass migrations of zooplankton and their predators to the ocean surface, where during the day, due to sunlight, they hide from the predators, and then at night they come to the surface and feed. And this is not only an extraordinary thing from the perspective of just observing things on Earth, but also it has a lot of big implications for the way carbon is cycled on the ocean, thinking about carbon export. And this process is guessed to be anywhere between 5 and 40% of the amount of carbon, responsible for the amount of carbon that's exported below. And we know that, you know, carbon that's exported to the ocean's depths is important for carbon sequestration and removal from the atmosphere. But back to ICET2, one of the projects that we funded through IDS is to use those observations. So basically the photon cloud or altimetry and observations in combination with field data and lab analyses to really look at the ice-ocean interface in greater detail with respect to physics and biogeochemical processes. In another project we funded, we're using polarized LiDAR, and the polarized LiDAR is different, of course, in the sense that it's a polarimeter, but that can be really helpful for ocean studies because there's some ocean phytoplankton that are calcifying and polarize light in such a way that they can be separated from other phytoplankton, provides additional information. And that project is using polarized LiDAR and passive remote sensing. So the radiometry style, the basic, our multispectral heritage ocean color to look at snow, ice, algae, and clouds. And that's done so that we might be able to begin to interpret how polarization measurements can be used and what the uncertainties are when thinking about other ocean worlds. And another project looks at sub-ice ocean processes in the Southern Ocean with landfast ice from basal radar reflectometry. So this is, I guess, a taste of the projects that you can expect to see funded for 3 years and starting now, which is exciting. I was really interested in a lot of the conversations that we had, and Catalina and I kind of just wanted to relay those to the group and have it serve as a way from maybe the ocean earth science perspective that we're engaging and questioning and wanting to contribute to studies on other ocean worlds and thinking about some of these areas where we can really come together with our observational techniques and others where our paradigm or the philosophy of we're thinking about things is just very different. And so what I was learning a lot about is this idea of looking for biosignatures and how the search for biosignatures can lead to things like confirmation bias, and that the group and the community is moving more toward this idea of what framework do we want to have life on the spectrum. And in the ocean, broadly speaking, and especially from ocean color measurements, we don't really think about life on the abiotic, prebiotic, biotic spectrum. It's very much a binary you know, they're phytoplankton, you know, in concentrations of 10 to the 8th per mil, you know, there's a lot of life and it's not hard to find at all in a lot of places, depending, I guess I should say, depending on what sensors you're using. So that's very different. And again, on that mode, like within the ocean, when you have a lot of life, if you were to look for biosignatures or evidence for life by looking at nutrients, for example, there's this paradox that if you have a lot of life, you've probably exhausted the nutrients. And so you might not even detect nutrients on Earth, which is the case when you go to different places in our modern ocean today. So thinking about signatures and what signatures might be appropriate to find for life sometimes could be tricky. What we've learned from our ocean is that you would maybe draw the conclusion that there's no life if you were looking for nitrate, for example, when in fact it's teeming with life, it just used all the nitrogen. And we've, you know, talked about this a lot, but that there's no perfect analog, unfortunately, but there are still a lot of places on Earth that at least represent some of that phase space of what we expect in other ocean worlds. So places with high pressure, low light, low temperature, you know, deep sea places, which NASA cannot access from satellites so far, and, you know, places with a lot of sea ice. One thing that because again, I'm Earth science centric, but before coming to the meeting, I really wasn't unaware of just the sheer volume of ice on these other ocean planets, which I think is truly fascinating, and thinking about different channels and areas in that ice and just the scale is so different. Just fun to think about. I'm sorry for the slide here. I wanted to kind of ask some questions and think about what science needs might be moving forward. And I think it's so helpful to have conversations like these, especially because I am coming, as I mentioned, from a bias of curiosity from other ocean worlds from the perspective of someone who's only ever looked at Earth as an ocean world. And so having more of these conversations to find places that truly are synergistic and ripe is exciting to me. So it seemed like there's a real need for more work on stability of clathrate systems and thinking about how subsurface oceans are preserved over the course of our history of the universe, but also thinking about where they're occurring above and below, and especially maybe underutilized connections between petroleum industries and subduction research to understand these ocean worlds and their rocky mantles and chemical cycling. One question that we've had in the ocean, there's always an issue of timescales. For example, phytoplankton divide on average once per day or double every day, and they're consumed at nearly that rate. And so it's just very, very different than life on land, even when you think about trees growing or grass growing and then these seasonal cycles. It's very dynamic in the ocean. And having these questions on other ocean worlds is so fun to think about and very tricky, especially thinking about what are these changing timescales? How does habitability change? And, you know, in these oceans and ocean life worlds, you know, what time scale are we talking about, and how do we model and represent that and even get a handle on it a bit? Questions about what are the expected pathways for chemical synthesis that we might expect. There's, you know, some research on Earth and thinking about nitrogen fixation in the ocean, for example. And with anything, you know, these organisms, phytoplankton, are wanting to take the most efficient route. And sometimes if those preferred molecules are not there, they have to go to less, you know, bioavailable forms, but that requires so much energy. And so when we're thinking about what might be available in other ocean worlds, it's, I think, interesting to think about what are the chemical species and are they bioavailable, I guess, as we know it. And again, it's from what I've heard, there's still all these outstanding questions of we shouldn't maybe expect there to be similar life forms or similar chemical pathways in our modern ocean as in these other ocean worlds for all the reasons talked about. At the same time, like what is a good starting place there? Another piece that's really, I think, is influential, especially with the research that we're investing in now on Earth, is to understand the flow of water in and beneath ice, and thinking about within ice when you have, you know, perched brine pools, for example, how that can relate to other ocean worlds, and in general permeability, both within ice and within the rock core, and how that water is transformed as it's moving through these spaces. So in thinking about possible synergies that are across and truly cross-cutting the cryosphere, ocean, and icy worlds orbiting other planets. One question that I think our program is sort of asking and wanting to support research in is understanding, if you zoom out to a satellite perspective, are there agnostic processes biogeochemically that can be applied to our larger fundamental understanding of the ocean? So rather than on Earth thinking about research that's very specific and attached to a place that has a suite of measurements we know is probably not, doesn't have a twin, in other places. Instead, what are these fundamental questions that we're asking, and how can those be shared across all of these places? And then is that a place for synergistic work? So that what these might look like are, very simple. How do organisms alter properties of ice? And can these properties also be produced abiotically? So this would be getting at a piece of, again, wanting to eliminate confirmation bias as much as possible when exploring and looking for life on other ocean worlds, to be sure that if you're observing a certain signal, it's a biotic signal, or you can rule out other places that it would be produced abiotically. And although we can't know perfectly if we use Earth as an analog, you can still, I think, constrain that space quite a bit by asking that question on Earth and then considering the range of possibilities in other places. Also, a broad question, but just thinking about the limits of life in fluids that have widely varying salinities, and thinking about the connections. On Earth, we have sodium chloride dominated seawater as a species, chemical species, but we know that might select for a certain suite of metabolic strategies, and then in other ocean worlds that might be very different. So as much as possible, wanting to understand those connections, and that leads to understanding really extreme environments on Earth, and thinking about, again, filling out the spectrum of like salinity space. And you could do that with every single ocean property, right? And then again, another broad question that we're thinking about is how we could predict ice thickness variation knowing the ocean properties. And that's definitely an inverse problem that has, I think, obvious connections to other ocean worlds. If you are only able to really observe ice and ice features, what can that tell you about the ocean beneath in terms of circulation or possible life, brine channels, connectivity, and things like that? And on Earth, this question has a lot of significance, not only in wanting to predict and understand better how ice will evolve on Earth today, but also the connections between understanding, ice on Earth and the ocean beneath it is still a very tricky problem for us on Earth. It's not like we've solved it by a mile, right? So having that conversation across, I think, both communities would be really important. There's more of these questions. These are a lot of my curiosities after attending the meeting and wanting to talk more about them. But yeah, so again, this inverse problem of thinking about ice and how it relates to the ocean, talked about the timescales and what is that equilibrium versus not. A lot of things in our ocean are considered to be steady state, and then sometimes new technology or new measurement, and you learn, okay, there's some differences and a lot more dynamicism than we might have expected. But the trick would want to be able to use abundances and relative abundances of different, organic species that can be sensed from satellite, that could then be used as tracers of what's happening in the subsurface. Because again, when I went to the meeting and was talking with colleagues, we got so excited thinking about, could we explore the oceans on these other ocean worlds autonomously like we do on Earth? And learning that is far away but not impossible is exciting. So thinking about the tech that would need to be invented, and again, on Earth within our icy area, we might not have 100 kilometers of ice, but there's still a big logistical challenge of observing within ice, possibly drilling in ice to get to the ocean, and then having really high quality measurements there. A lot of what I want to talk about is sort of synergies today. But, as you probably know, it's everywhere in the news. These marine carbon dioxide removal strategies are becoming very, they're heavily invested by both our government and in other governments globally, and a lot of companies as well, commercial companies as well, to really think about geoengineering efforts and thinking about how can we, sequester excess CO2. And so within that space, and there's a lot happening in that space, is, that might be a place to also tap into and think about, are there analogs to carbonate chemistry and other icy ocean worlds, and are there opportunities within modeling that could be easily implemented within ongoing modeling efforts there. We've talked about, at least as much as possible on Earth, which is we typically, at least from a satellite perspective from our program, think about slightly more binary. Is that a phytoplankton particle, actively dividing, or is it dirt, detritus? It's less of a spectrum, but still being able to understand what the abiotic baseline is in order to understand what's biotic and what these instruments are really seeing is important. And then in developing that more, both optically and in tandem with modeling and in situ work, is important. I think the question a lot of us have been wondering is how ocean circulation is different in these places, and the degree of stratification, ice dynamics, again, permeability through the ice and how that influences circulation is really a big question. And from my understanding right now, it's totally unconstrained to the point where simulations are running with the total phase space unconstrained, and it's highly computationally expensive, and it can kind of, it's anybody's guess in a way, and then with observations to add that, it can get you closer. So I think that kind of question as well would be very portable to Earth's ocean as well. Even though we've done and developed a lot more of our understanding of ocean circulation, there are still a lot of questions about how that operates in icy seas. And part of that is because there's such a challenge in observing ice, even from, logistically getting there, of course, but then having the synoptic view of ice from satellites isn't possible with swath type passive ocean color instruments, at least, because they need sunlight. And so you miss so much of that during the year. And the LiDAR satellites that we're using are really special. At the same time, they can't really permeate through the ice. And the instruments that we have deployed that operate underneath the ice by design, so they don't, so they're still useful, they turn around 20 meters before they actually get to the ice when they detect cold water. And so we are missing a lot of information about that space, and thinking about instrumentation that can help their modeling efforts, et cetera, and observations would be really great, and have a lot of relevance for other ocean worlds. Also thinking about crystalline ice structure. Yeah.
This is fantastic, but could you wrap in about 1 minute? Because I want to get to a couple questions and then give time for the other half.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry, I didn't even realize this time. So this is great, last slide. Basically, as a program, we want to invest in improving ocean literacy. That includes ocean worlds and our ocean. And so we want to know how we can do that best. We also want to think about preparing for in situ work if possible, but that is something that we can help a lot more as a community, because we've been doing that for a long time, and we don't need to start from scratch there. And thinking then about supporting, the next generation. And again, this kind of gets into ocean literacy, but specifically, like a academic, government style ocean literacy, to have this multidisciplinary effort happen. And thank you. And I'm sorry, I got back late from a trip overseas last night. I feel like with the jet lag and the caffeine I've been pumping today, I'm just going. So I'll wrap up here, and thanks everyone for your time.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And I really loved all the sort of synergies you pointed out, but we have a nice contrasting question in the Mentius, which is, what do you think are the limits or pitfalls for the synergies between Earth and ocean research and extraterrestrial ocean research? So, what do we have to be careful when we're, trying to look for these synergies?
Mm-hmm. I think in general, the assumptions that we make on Earth are not going to be the same as those in other ocean worlds. And so even with a modeling study, for example, you have to build it up, and the assumptions you make will be Earth-centric by design. And so with the synergy work, I think as much as possible, what would be important to consider is, tackling on, for us, what feels second nature, it wouldn't for other ocean worlds, for example. So working with planetary scientists or vice versa, I think naturally will come out that some of these pitfalls, both groups will want to make sure that they're learning something new and that it's not super weighted toward one or the other, would be an issue. And then there's some maybe philosophical things like that I've mentioned before, at least in the detection for life, for example. What we have available on Earth in terms of tech is more advanced, I think, than what we can currently have for other ocean worlds. And at one point, people from the community on the ocean side might ask, if we were to apply the same tech on other ocean worlds to our ocean, what can we learn? And I think that question could shut down research in productivity in some ways, if there's not as well this idea of what more do we need to add on, or what data are needed to make this happen. Because if some things that, you can't put an Argo float right now on Europa. That's fine. That shouldn't be the end of like a collaboration that's thinking about how these things work, but rather what is the important aspect that we're getting from the Argo? Is there any way we could get that in the ocean world? And if not, what if we do the study on Earth without that float? What happens? What changes? And I think patience is probably also something that I would say a pitfall would be in patience with these types of collaborations, because a lot of our, I feel like a lot of communities haven't necessarily worked a lot on these interface type ideas. So.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelsey, again. There are a couple other questions. We'll see if we have time to come back to them at the end. But for now, let's switch gears.
Okay, perfect. And our next speaker is Curt Niebur from he's a program scientist for the Outer Planets and Ocean Worlds in the Planetary Science Division at NASA headquarters. And this talk will provide an overview of the science and measurements of the upcoming NASA Planetary Ocean Worlds missions, such as Europa, Clipper, and Dragonfly. Curt, take it away.
Sure. And as I'm sharing my screen, let me just say that I second a lot of stuff that Kelsey mentioned, because I think there's a lot of great overlap. And the really cool thing about the missions and the ocean worlds that exist is that Earth's ocean and those ocean worlds have so many similarities, and yet they're also so very different as well. So, the similarities end at some point and you get to these unique ocean worlds. I'd also like to put in a plug for the workshop that she mentioned and some of the comments she made, to sort of put this group on alert, because, the questions and the comments being made about, how can Earth science and planetary science work together? How can Earth oceanographers and planetary scientists work together are great ones, because you might all be assuming that surely Kelsey and I are talking together all the time. We are not. Okay, I want to be very honest about that. At headquarters, you don't have a lot of time to pursue that kind of synergistic work, to squeeze out every little bit of science synergy you can, especially across divisions. And what free time we do have, we usually spend on other stuff. So I really value workshops and mini conferences like that, and feedback from groups like this one as well, because not only do we not have time at headquarters, the best ideas come from you folks, not from within the walls at NASA headquarters. So please, I encourage you to keep thinking along these lines and to share your thoughts. So today I am going to be going very fast through this, because this is largely not so much a teaser talk, but a get acquainted talk. So I know we have a very diverse audience that attends these lectures and views them. For those of you who know a lot about Clipper and Dragonfly, I apologize. You're probably going to be a little bit bored. You might want to check your email. But for those of you that aren't, hopefully we can give you a few signposts to help you understand what's going on. And finally, before I get into the slides, let me say that now is a fantastic time to be an oceanographer, both on Earth and for other planets, because we actually have missions going to these extraterrestrial oceans. What a fantastic thing, if you think about it. That's the good news. The bad news is we're about a decade away from getting there. So some patience is going to be required. The Europa Clipper mission is on track to launch next October. It will get to Europa around 2031, and the Dragonfly mission will get to Titan around 2034, I believe. So the 2030s are going to be even better than the 2020s. So we got that going out for us. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Europa Clipper. Europa Clipper is all about the huge saltwater ocean that we're confident is present underneath Europa's ice shell. Europa is a large moon of Jupiter, about the size of Earth's moon. It has a global saltwater ocean beneath an ice crust anywhere from 4 or 5 kilometers thick to 60 kilometers thick. Twice as much water as all of Earth's oceans combined. So Europa has a very straightforward purpose: to learn as much about Europa as a system, not just about the ocean, but about Europa as a system, to assess its habitability. I want to be clear, we're not looking for life. We're not even looking for biosignatures. Those are very hard things to do. We're answering the much simpler question of, are the basic ingredients there? And you can see this slide has a lot of information about those basic ingredients. But just to sort of orient you, I mentioned that thick ice shell that caps the ocean. The ocean isn't exposed anywhere, but that cap, that ice shell on the ocean, just as we've discovered on Earth, has a very important role to play, and potentially a very dynamic role to play. And that's why I say we're not sending Clipper there just to study Europa's ocean. We're sending Clipper there to study Europa as a system, to better understand the ocean as well, because you can't study the ocean in isolation. Just like on Earth, you can't just study plankton and feel that you understand the ocean. You can't just study the bottom of the ocean and feel you understand the ocean. You have to take a much more systematic approach. That is what Europa Clipper is doing. And that is what sets it apart as what we call a flagship mission, our largest scale missions that we do. It has much broader scope than some of our smaller, more focused missions. So the specific science goals and objectives for Europa Clipper, as I already mentioned, to assess the habitability of this ocean world. And to do that, you've got to get at the objectives of understanding that ice shell and the ocean that it is capping. Understand the composition, both at the surface and potentially deeper down of the ocean and of the ice. And although I think this is often overlooked, the geology. We aren't studying the geology of Europa because it's separate from the goal. We're looking at the geology because it's a critical component of assessing the habitability. That dynamic aspect of the ice shell that I mentioned, whether or not the ice shell is convecting and bringing material from the ocean to the surface and from the surface back into the ocean, you understand that by looking at the geology. You understand that by looking at the surface expression of those dynamics. And Europa, despite the fact that it is probably the flattest, smoothest object in the solar system, has some truly bizarre and weird geology going on. There are no mountains on Europa, but we do see plenty of evidence of, for lack of a fancier term, well, and we have a fancier term in Latin, but I won't share it with you. We have cracks all over the place. We have places where it looks like the water from underneath melted parts of the surface and set rafts of ice shifting about. We have places where it looks like there might have been some kind of eruption of subsurface material onto the surface. We have evidence that shows that the entire ice shell globally has shifted back and forth. So it's an incredibly dynamic place. And that's why you need all of these things, the ice shell, the composition, the geology, in order to understand that ocean that is buried beneath the surface. I'm not going to go into detail on this. These are the science requirements that we have for Europa Clipper. And these are actually kind of old now, but they're usually fairly stable. I don't want to speak to these, but the point I want to get across to all of you, and I'll return to it later, is that there is a special skill in how you can interpret what a NASA mission is going to do. And one of those skills is the science requirements and the science objectives. It really behooves you as a scientist, if you want to understand what a mission is about and you want to use or anticipate the data that the mission will generate, to understand what we call level 1 science requirements are. This is what NASA expects a mission to generate. These are the science requirements that NASA specifies before we start defining and building a mission, and then we build the mission around this so that it can accomplish these things. So if you want to understand the science measurements that a NASA mission to an ocean world like Titan or Europa is going to do, you must understand this. This is the starting point. So again, I'm not going to speak to these in depth, but I encourage you, if you're interested in Europa and Europa Clipper, to make this your starting point. And we'll come back to what your next step is after this later. Okay, so what is Europa Clipper? Unfortunately, unlike our Earth science colleagues, putting an orbiter around Europa is problematic because the radiation environment would kill that orbiter within weeks to maybe a couple months. We wouldn't be able to get the global coverage we want. So instead, we are doing about 50 flybys. And the concept here is you fly by Europa really fast for a short amount of time, get through that high radiation environment, and then get the heck out of Dodge to where the radiation's not so bad. That way you can survive years, perhaps a decade. And then you combine all these different flybys into your global data set. That's what you see in those small icons to the right for each of our instruments. Each flyby adds more data to that global data set and builds it up and up and up. And we need about 4 years to do that. And you might be pointing out, hey, Curt, it's a really bad idea to compile a map over a 4-year time span because things change. And you've got a valid point. Fortunately, the time scale of change for planetary science is a lot longer than it is for Earth science. And the other nice thing we have going for us is we want there to be change. We want to be there long enough that we can detect that change and quantify it. And this helps us do that to a certain extent. So you have that global web of flybys. It also means that you're going to have to be patient because it's going to take time for those flybys to fill in the data set. There's going to be a lot of holes in it that slowly get filled in. This is a representation of the payload that we have. We have 9-ish instruments. I say 9-ish because there's actually 10, but I always make the point of saying that there's 9 because I get criticized by my bosses frequently that we pick too many instruments. But we have 2 cameras on board called ICE, EIS, a narrow angle and a wide angle. I count those as 1 so that we can get the number down to 9 and I can get yelled at less frequently. So in the blue in the lower part there, that's our remote sensing payload. We have a thermal imager, we have a UV spectrograph, we have visual cameras, narrow and wide angle. We have an infrared imaging spectrometer, and we have an ice penetrating radar. Above that in the yellow, you see our in situ instruments. And I use in situ carefully here because I want to be clear. We're not landing. We're not drilling in to the ice. And Kelsey, we should talk about how difficult it is to do that because that would be a fun conversation. But these in situ instruments, while we're not landing, are touching pieces of Europa. The mass spectrometer instrument is ingesting stuff from Europa, usually in the form of volatiles that have been ejected from the surface. The dust analyzer SUDA is doing similar things for dust that has been lofted from the surface by micrometeoroid impacts, which happen very, very frequently on Europa. I remember in the early days, somebody who was not a Europa scientist was raging that SUDA was a ridiculously stupid instrument to have on board because it's only going to get 4 data points. Because how often do meteoroids hit Europa? And it was a lot of fun pointing out that he was off by a couple orders of magnitude. There will be thousands of these data points, tens of thousands potentially. We have a magnetometer on board as well as a few Faraday cups to measure the plasma environment. And that is used to make a calibration, a correction, to make sure that the magnetometer is able to extract the magnetic signal from Europa's ocean, which is very tiny, in the presence of Jupiter's magnetic field, which is, other than the sun, the most powerful magnetic field in the solar system. So This is where all of the instruments sit on the spacecraft. That's really not of great interest to all of you. I just like showing pictures of the spacecraft. This is also a good time to point out, I'll point out two things. You can't quite see ice, but the ice narrow angle camera is about yay big around and about yay tall. These instruments are not small. And I think we're spending about $350 million, $400 million on this payload. So what does this look like when we get to Europa? Because what we often explain to everyone is that we don't have 9 different instruments working separately. We have a payload working together. And working together is how they get the science done. So this is kind of a neat series of graphics to try to highlight that. One thing I haven't mentioned is the gravity measurements, because that's usually considered a freebie for planetary missions. We measure the Doppler signal from the communications array, and that way we can extract the signal from gravitational mass concentrations and get at the internal structure. So what you also get as you fly by is magnetometry and plasma. Granted, this is an artist rendering, but this gives you an idea. You also get imaging, so you can see that adds those surface features, that geology. What you're looking at here is an area we call chaos, which is one of those areas where it looks like it was heated from underneath and just kind of mixed and globbed all together, and that something arose from underneath, which is what you get with your infrared imaging spectrometer, giving you compositional data of what all that brown gunk is. Then you get thermal imaging, which can tell you where there are hot spots, where eruptions might be occurring, or where there's subsurface lakes within 1 kilometer or 2 of the surface. You get radar, revealing all of that subsurface structure, which is a very new and very novel capability for planetary science missions. You get ultraviolet data, giving you an idea of what kind of atmospheric composition you have as well, and what's being evolved from the surface. And finally, that gas and dust mass spectroscopy that is giving you direct compositional sampling of what is being released from the surface. And these are exquisitely well-tuned instruments that are going to provide compositional data beyond what we've seen on other planetary missions. So that's everything for Europa Clipper. Let me talk very quickly about Dragonfly. Dragonfly is our first aerial science mission to another planet. We are going to land on Titan and then spend a few years flying around it with this rotorcraft. These are the science objectives for Titan. What makes it habitable? What chemical processes are going on there? Has life developed beyond Earth? These are the goals. And again, like I said before, you need to start with these to understand what data you can expect, what science you can expect that you as scientists will be using. But Dragonfly is really about understanding this unique characteristic of Titan, which is that it's a icy world, an ocean world with a thick atmosphere and the most complex organic chemistry that is occurring beyond Earth. And we're not talking about parts per billion kind of things here. We're talking about organic chemistry that you can see with the naked eye. There are about 6 different instruments on Dragonfly: a mass spectrometer, a drill, meteorology sensors, cameras, a gamma ray neutron spectrometer as well. We'll be able to get a lot of data back from Dragonfly. Here we're back to that point I made a while ago, understanding what those level 1 science requirements are. And I know we're getting short on time, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but that column, that large column there, that's labeled S04E01 through S04E01, that's the science you're all going to get from this mission. That's the data you're going to get back. These are the instruments that are going to collect it. This is what you need to know about the mission. And in summary, you can read all of this about Dragonfly. Again, it's our first mission, our first science mission that's going to fly. This is a rover without wheels, a rover with rotors. It is going to be phenomenally exciting, both in terms of public engagement and in terms of science, because as I said, it's going to a truly unique destination in the solar system. Now, the point I want to leave all you with is this, and I alluded to this earlier. I mentioned you have to know what the level 1 science requirements are so you know what the mission is going to do. But if you really want the meat and potatoes for a mission, you've got to learn to love what we call science traceability matrices. And these are the small font things that you sometimes encounter. And they're structured with from the general on the left to the very specific on the right. So science objectives on the left, down to specific measurements on the right, and the performance requirements for those measurements. I know you can't read this, and it is not my intent for you to read this. My intent is to make sure that I convey the message to you that if you want to understand what ocean world measurements NASA is going to take on these 2 missions, it's all laid out right here in the science traceability matrices in gory detail. So I point you all to these, and I encourage you all to look at them in detail and to plan your research campaigns for the next 10 years. Because this is not just about doing research on the data that's returned. It's about doing research now in preparation for that data to arrive in the early to mid 2030s. And NASA is already investing in its RNA programs for that. So that is all I have to say, and I will stop here for questions.
Thanks a lot, Kurt. That was actually a perfect intro to I think one of the first questions. 1 second, which is, how much do we understand on the surface organic chemistry from both endogenous or exogenous sources of organics at these icy ocean worlds? And, you know, is NASA interested in funding this sort of research?
Yeah, I would say we know much more about Titan because we know next to nothing about Europa. But also because for Titan, we have some mass spectroscopy data from Cassini flybys in the very upper atmosphere and from telescopic observations. And that's how, frankly, we know that Titan is an organics factory. I mean, it is just spitting out weird organics all the time. You know, years ago, there was a press release saying that we identified one of the constituents of Tupperware in Titan's atmosphere. Tupperware does not use simple organic compounds. You know, we're not talking about, you know, some combination of CHO with you know, 10 to 20 mass units. We're talking hundreds of atomic mass unit organics. Now, do we understand them? No. That's half the fun, right? That's why we're going.
Great. And let's see, here's another question. Maybe both you and Kelsey sort of have a take on this, but sort of, I guess, what in situ measurements, you know, would be most valuable on the one hand to help the PACE and GLIMR in interpreting the PACE and GLIMR data sets, but also would be, I guess, in that sense, valuable to you know, helping these future missions to Europa or excuse me, Titan. Thank you.
Well, I'll let Kelsey take the first crack at that one.
Yeah,
Sure. I feel like I've dominated the first more than the first half of the meeting. So Kurt, I'm happy to let you answer as well. For validating PACE and GLIMR, we're really interested in having phytoplankton community composition measurements. And I don't know that there's an expectation or curiosity that there are photosynthetic organisms, you know, in these other ocean worlds, given the ice cover. But briefly, what we would use is taxonomy information and high performance liquid chromatography to assess different pigment concentrations. Pigments that are photosynthetic are very useful to say, okay, this is a living organism. And then we'll also be taking a suite of genomic measurements as well to help validate further the different types of organisms, their expressions, and who's doing what.
And I would just add for Europa, yeah, you're right. We're not anticipating photosynthetic organisms because of the ice cover. And you also have the distance as well to contend with. So, you know, phytoplankton doesn't really do well with 1/25 the light levels. We're far more interested in chemosynthetic life forms. And a key question there that's related to this, though, is how does transport through the ice shell fractionate those chemical signatures that might be indicative of the presence of chemosynthetic life? Because even if it's chock full of chemosynthetic life, if that fractionation process doesn't transport those signatures to the surface, we're not going to find them unless we drill.
Okay, thanks. I think this is a great last question because I think we're all curious. So for Dragonfly, if it happens to land on a methane or ethane lake or pond, will it sink or float?
Yeah, it'll sink. It's solid metal. It's got a plutonium power source. It's going to sink like a rock, which is why we're not going to land on a lake. But in all seriousness, Dragonfly is about halfway between the equator and the poles, and it's really the polar regions that have those lakes. And in fact, when Dragonfly gets there, I think the lakes will actually be in shadow. So we are not going to get any good views of the lakes, even in an extended mission. We are flying to a crater, though. So I think the views of the crater, especially from the air, are going to be fantastic.
All right. Great. Well, thank you both, Kelsey and Curt, for really phenomenal talks. And thanks to the audience for tuning in and asking good questions. I think that finishes up the first episode of season 4